Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of the podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education, or an episode with a guest or multiple guests. In this week's interview, I'm having a discussion with Sara Lev, where we talk about the place for joy in teaching and learning, the impact of remote learning on project-based learning in early childhood, misconceptions around PBL in early childhood, encouraging curiosity by responding to questions with questions, social and emotional learning, which is SEL, the impact of yoga and meditation on teaching, and so much more. The show notes includes links to other podcasts and organizations and resources that were mentioned in this episode, and you can find that at jaredoleary.com or by visiting the link in the app that you're listening to this on. On my website, you will find hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, including a link to Boot Up PD, which is the nonprofit that I work for. In addition, you'll find a bunch of drumming and gaming content because I'm into both of those as well. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Sara.
Hi, I am Sara Lev. I am a teacher. I am an instructional coach. I'm an author. And my work centers really around empowering people, both adults and children, to become joyful and independent learners. I'm particularly passionate about project-based learning and learner-centered practices, social emotional learning, and embed all of that into my work with both children and adults. And I'm particularly passionate about early childhood educators.
And how do you empower people to become joyful? Because that's a very deep and praiseworthy goal to do.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is about really knowing who your learners are, whether that's children or adults, what matters to them, where they come from, and bringing those characteristics or those interests into the learning process and making sure that learning should be joyful and it should be fun and it should be joyful for me too. So really trying to find ways to tap into joy when I am teaching and learning.
I had a professor once who, this was for a curriculum class, was talking about standards and was like, the things that you put on standards are the things that you then measure and assess, which then is very telling the fact that the things that we are caring about does not include joy and interest in actually wanting to learn and whatnot. And that has always stuck with me of why is it that we aren't trying to assess whether or not kids are having a wonderful time learning? The point is just to learn a fact or a skill or an action. It's not to learn to love learning, which is, I think, a huge missed opportunity.
Absolutely. And yeah, to love learning and to love your own questions and your curiosities and the relationships that you have, right, in a learning environment. And so I think a lot of the joy has to come from the relationships that get built with me, but also the relationships that are being developed with students, right? Or teachers, right? Even if it's in a very short professional development setting, those relationships are very important. So really just being aware of those things.
Yeah. Can you tell me a story about an experience in education that continues to have an impact on you?
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting to think about this in that context. I got an email from a former student. Now, remember, my students, when I have them, are 5 years old. And I received an email from a student right after she graduated high school. And this was 2020. And I got an email from her out of the blue. She wanted to write to me as she was reflecting on her schooling and her education, specifically the experience she had as a kindergartner in my class. And it was really stunning. Actually, I can read a little bit if you don't mind.
Yeah.
She said, I graduated high school last week and I wanted to reach out to say hi and thank you. Your classroom provided an incredibly sound, creative spirit and critical thinking foundation that I've built upon over the last 13 years. As a little kid in your class, I just thought we were having fun. And that was how all school was. I now know that your classroom was truly a special and unique place. And she tells about how she went on to this project-based learning high school, an engineering school. And she says, it was utterly apparent from the first day of freshman year that I had something most of these kids didn't, profound curiosity. Simply put, I was excited to learn. I am excited to learn. Thank you for cultivating that. And in light of what we just talked about with the joy and independence, right? Yeah, it's wonderful to look back at that email with that lens because she talks about both those things, right? She was having fun, but also she developed these critical thinking skills and curiosity. And that's being an independent learner. And, why it was so powerful was that, as a teacher of very young children, we don't often get to follow up with our students. Maybe if you're a high school teacher, you might see them or hear from them, but, I don't get that. And so I'm often wondering, will they even remember what I'm doing? you know, and what kind of impact will this project or this learning experience have on these young children? And so she said she was a COVID class of 2020. And to get that email in that time was very powerful. And even now in challenges, I reflect on that email and just think about like, okay, I might not know, but what I'm doing, I'm hoping is making an impact.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective that I didn't have. So in the K-12 side of things, the shortest time that I'd see students would be about 4 years. So like when I was teaching high school, the drumline stuff, I'd see them from 9th grade through 12th grade. When I was teaching computer science, it was a K-8 school. So I saw all 9 of those grade levels over the course of several years and whatnot. So that is an interesting point to consider. If you only have 1 year, then I don't know what happens after that.
Yeah. And that student, I actually was in a school, we had them for 3 years. So I had K1 and 2, which was incredible. But for now, it's only 1 year. Yeah, for kindergarten. So I did get to know her really well, but we started when she was only 5.
So I'm curious, like, what really resonated with that particular student? So if you could kind of describe like an ideal PBL experience with like early childhood, what would somebody see or experience going into that kind of a space?
Yeah. I mean, I think first off, opportunities for agency and independence. And when I think about what that means and what that looks like, it starts with asking questions and really making space for children to ask questions and not answer them directly, right? To really inspire questioning and modeling questioning. You would hear questions and hear students helping one another. Often a child will ask a question. I'll be like, who thinks they might be able to answer that question or help that child? Again, going back to that idea of relationships and connection. So there's this sense of agency and that I'm really giving children the chance to do what they can on their own. And if not, I'm going to help them or scaffold so that they will be able to do it. You will see a lot of small groups and partnerships. You will see a lot of kids doing different things. Sometimes it's loud. Different teachers have different tolerance for that kind of energy, right? So I really think about it as a type of energy and that you will feel. A lot of people call it a buzz, right? But for some teachers, that feels really crazy, But I think if you walk into a PBL classroom, like what you're not going to see is like sitting in silence, right? Compliance, right? I'm putting air quotes up. Because that's not what it's about. Learning is active and it's engaging and it's talking and it's relationship. So that's what I hope my classroom is. And I hope that's what people would see in that environment.
Yeah, I really like your point about children asking questions and not answering them directly. I met with my principal once after he did an observation and he rated me like a 4 out of 5 on question techniques. And I was like, wait, a 4 out of 5? Like I literally never responded with a direct answer. I was only asking questions throughout the entire class. And he's like, yes, you were great, but what would get this to be a 5 out of 5 is if the students were asking questions of each other. And I was like, oh, I really like that. I'm glad he pointed that out. That was a really important thing for me to consider is I shouldn't be the only one who's asking questions in the classroom. What about the impact of remote learning on PBL? How has that kind of changed things or what has stayed the same?
Remote learning really stretched me in that year. I mean, I taught remotely, picture my kids 4 and 5 years old who had never met each other when they started the school year. They'd never been in school before. So, I mean, for me, I really thought a lot about how I could build a learning environment that was positive and relationship based, all the same things that I always had, but over Zoom. And that was really challenging. But I think PBL was really the way that I could do it. So the projects I designed and developed that year were actually some of my favorite I've ever done. Like we designed a website, we produced a podcast, we actually wrote a book and published a book. We did this all over Zoom, but we were able to do it. I got obsessed with collaboration, because I think that was the thing that really stretched me the most. How are we going to collaborate if my kids are not together? And so I just did a lot of thinking and experimenting. The other thing that happened with remote learning, the impact it had was, I had a lot of flexibility in the structure of my day, and I had small groups every afternoon on Zoom for 20 minutes. And it was actually amazing. We had these small groups, there was no interruptions, very focused attention, 4 to 5 children at a time, right? And this really helped with feedback and revisions for writing collaboratively. It was actually easier in some ways because now I'm back in person trying to do small groups. You have all this noise and interruption. So I actually tried, instead of doing the small groups this year in my classroom, I found an empty space to bring them to. That experience of remote learning impacted my teaching, because I realized for the most effective small group work in that kind of environment, the benefit of a breakout room, right? It really is like essentially creating a breakout room in the live space. So I'm lucky I have an associate teacher so that she can stay with them. So in any case, it stretched me in my ways of thinking about collaboration, and also like feedback and revision. It was actually better on Zoom with my kids.
Yeah, it's interesting how while there have been some constraints involved with going to remote learning, there's also been some affordances where it's enabled you to do things that you might not have considered. And that is interesting that you then took that and went, how can I apply this into an in-person context?
Yeah. And I don't think I ever would have tried a podcast if I weren't on Zoom, because I was thinking, well, what can we do like that's feasible, that works in the technology, like that was kind of interesting. And now I would try to do it again.
Yeah, especially with that age. Like, I think when people think of like the examples you gave of creating a website or a book or a podcast, like all of those, like they might think, okay, maybe later in elementary school, but not necessarily kinder.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody's listening to this and they're skeptical, like, I don't know about PBL with this particular age group that young, what are the benefits? Like, how would you respond to somebody like that?
Project-based learning, like I was saying about joy and agency, right? And I'm trying to think about say a more traditional learning environment, because certainly there are, environments that aren't PBL, but might be learner centered, where there will still be that sense of agency. So I'm thinking about preschools often, like Reggio inspired environments. So certainly that's possible. But yeah, it's all about joy and agency, right? The sense of surprise around what young children can do, the relationships children build with me and with one another, like where children can really see the why behind their learning. That is what project-based learning is, right? The purpose and the relevance. And this is true for PBL at any age, but for young children, it's so magical and so full of wonder, right? Like I use that word wonderful, like it's full of wonder because they have this confidence. And I love seeing the growth over time, especially this year. My children have come in this year with most of them no school, right? In the pandemic, staying home, no preschool. So coming in very different place than in a typical year, and seeing my children, my students' growth in agency, taking initiative with their learning, questioning, finding answers. I mean, it can be quantified. I mean, really, my first project of the year, we had a set of, what I call need to know questions, right? The questions that kids generate. And there were three questions. And now I wish I could show you, a chart, our most recent project, something like 25 or 30 questions that children are generating. So you really can actually see the growth.
Yeah.
So some of the benefits, are that I think PBL is just very special in any age in terms of giving kids that authenticity and purpose. And for young children, it's even more because I don't think there's many places in their life where they have that kind of, so it's special.
What about some of the misconceptions around PBL in early childhood? So like as an example, when I've spoken with like high school teachers, some of them will be like, oh yeah, PBL is great for high school, but like you couldn't do it with any grades younger than that, especially not with like kindergarten. It's like, well.
Absolutely. And that's what our book that I co-wrote is framed around those misconceptions. It's actually called Overcoming Misconceptions and Reaching Success. That's the title because that's so common, right? So each chapter of our book is literally a misconception that we heard from teachers. So for example, my kids can't read or write yet. How can they do projects? Or they're too needy. They can't work together. That's not going to work, right? These are actually things that we heard from teachers. Another misconception is around research, because there is a misconception that research is reading a book and writing a report, right? Or giving a presentation. That's not what research is. Research is investigation and exploration and experimentation, right? And young children are actually experts at doing research when you reframe it. And so the literacy piece, like asking, oh, yeah, maybe they can't read or write, or maybe they're emergent in their skills around literacy. How do they communicate their thoughts and ideas? Because that's what literacy is. It's about communication. It's also about identity, right? It's about skills. It's more than skills. Another big one teachers have is like, oh, I have to front load too much content, right? My kids aren't ready. I need to teach them too much content to do it.
Yeah.
And so that's a misunderstanding of, yes, young children, but also PBL, right? You learn through a project. You don't learn prior to the project. And that's true for young children as well. There's lots of misconceptions that, are grounded in real experiences. And they're certainly valid, right? And I do think the reason we wrote the book, and even my experience as an early childhood educator, when I first was getting training and going through workshops, you're really looking for models of young children doing project-based learning. And often you might not get those. And so if you don't get them, then you really doubt and you say, well, why are you only showing me a third grade and a fifth grade example of this? And that's kind of was my experience at first. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to write the book, because I wanted to really dispel the myths, but also give some examples. And a lot of my work right now, in terms of like, we have a website and we host a blog, like is giving teachers examples so that they know they can do it.
What about with COVID? There are many teachers who are talking about learning loss. And I've heard some responses who are just like, I don't have time for PBL. I need to focus on reading, writing, arithmetic.
Yeah, right. Foundational skills. That's what everyone's saying. Yeah. We learn them through project-based learning. And again, it's about that engagement and purpose, because that misconception that, if there's learning loss, the way to learn is by what?
Skill and drill. Yeah.
Drill and kill, right? Like that's not purposeful learning. And that's definitely not joyful, in my opinion. You have to believe that project-based learning is learning, right? It's not extra. It's the way that learning happens. And I would argue it's more meaningful and it works. Children learn, right? So my children are definitely learning through projects. So I would say you really have to have that belief. You have to believe, but I don't believe that drill and kill the way that kids learn best.
So one of the things that I like to do is when I like strongly agree with something, try and think of, well, when would I disagree with the thing that I strongly agree with, or when would I not do it? So in the case of PBL, like when would you not do PBL with early childhood?
It might be hard if you're in a school that is very wedded to a particular scope and sequence or curriculum without much flexibility. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that is more challenging. Or if it's a school environment that doesn't have like a very positive learning culture, because you need to build that culture in order to do PBL effectively. You can't do PBL in a culture where there's a lot of shame or blame or punitive, that kind of culture. That would be really challenging. But I still think there's a lot of teachers out there like doing PBL in their own little islands, even when they are in those kind of environments. So some is definitely better than none. I would just say that it might be more challenging. I don't know that it's impossible.
Yeah, I did like a modified version. So in a district that I was in, the 7th and 8th graders were required to do a JavaScript course. And it was a very sequenced course. Like you go through step 1, and then when you finish step 1, you go to step 2. Like everybody's gone through the same sequence. But what I did was make it so that, okay, Monday through Thursday, we're going to do this thing we're required to do. But on Friday, you're going to take whatever you learned, wherever you're at in the course, and you're going to apply it into your own unique project. And we're going to keep revisiting this every single Friday. And so you're going to keep expanding upon your ideas and what you're learning and applying it into this thing that is of interest to you. And so that's what I did for that year where it was required. And that modification made it so that were taking something they were learning, contextualizing it in something they were interested in. And then eventually kids were like, hey, I want to spend more time on this thing than just the one day. And so after that first year, I was like, all right, cool. You can work on projects for as long as you want.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's great.
Now, if we were to zoom back out to some of the things that have influenced you, I'm curious, what's a piece of advice related to education that has really resonated with you?
Back when I was in graduate school, I had this wonderful advisor named Judy Leipzig, and we had like small groups, an advisory group. And I remember her saying something that was so simple, but it made a huge impact on me. And what she said was, when a child asks you a question, your first response should be, what do you think? And when I think about the way that I teach, I feel like that encapsulates so much of what I believe. It's such a simple thing, but the values that I hold as an educator, number one, that I'm not like a sage on the stage, right? My role is to facilitate learning. My role is to empower young children to go seek their own answers, right? With my support or with scaffolding. So that little phrase, that little response, what do you think, is turning it on to the child to say, oh, wait, I have ideas. I have experiences. I have value, right? And all of that is sort of wrapped up in that one sentence. And so I use that, I don't know how many times a day, right? Like think about how many times, not just young children, even adults might ask questions, right? And you might say, well, what do you think? So many times teachers of older grades tell me, well, kids ask so many questions and when they're young and then it gets just pushed out of them, And I'm like, well, why is that? Why is that happening that students just over time view questions as a negative, as a signifier of a lack of knowledge, versus a signifier of curiosity and interest, like my student was saying in the beginning. And so I think that that piece of advice she gave me is so powerful. And then a lot of teachers say, well, then what if they say, oh, I don't know, and then I say, they ask me a question. I say, what do you think? And the kid's like, I don't know. And I say, well, how can we find out together? Or how do you think we can find out? And that really opens it up to, well, I could do this. I could ask this person. You could show me this. Right. But again, it's empowering. It's giving the student, the child, the agency and the confidence in themselves as a learner. And that's really my goal, to have kids grow confident as learners so they can go take that beyond the classroom.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. I had kids sometimes be like, why won't you just tell me the answer, when I'd respond with a question and be like, because what if you have a question and I'm not here? What if there's a substitute here? Or what if you're at home and you're working on this and you don't know? Like, I'm trying to teach you how to teach yourself to figure out solutions to this or think through potential solutions down the road. And most of the time it would click and they'd be like, oh, I get it. But sometimes they'd be like, but I just want to know the answer.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this comes up a lot with spelling with young children, and parents, right? And so a lot of times parents think that the way to teach children spelling is by spelling it for them, right? And a lot of children will come to our class going, how do you spell that? And I always say, well, what do you think? Now, if children don't yet have the phonemic awareness to spell, then I just say, well, you have a choice. You can try on your own, or I can just write it for you. But telling a child how to spell something is actually not helping them with anything. And so we call it brave spelling. I mean, this is a research-based approach, invented spelling. We call it brave spelling. But when I tell parents this, they're always like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Because I say to them, look, if you are constantly telling them how to spell things, what will they do when you're not there, or when any adult isn't there? They've got to look inside and go, what do I know about letters and words and sounds? And then, I had a child once who, she told her parent, you know what, Dad, did you know that I can spell any word? And she was 6, and how amazing is that? It's real, because then she's not hindered in her writing, right? There's definitely a place for what we call dictionary, standardized spelling and learning words and all of that, of course, but not during like a writing time, because this is about their voice, right? So anyway, it's the same idea of like what I tell children, like you can try it on your own,
I'm interested in how philosophies or approaches to education kind of change over time. So my own, when I first started, is very different than it is today. So for you, I'm curious, like when you first began in education, what's something that you no longer believe that you used to?
For some reason, I had this belief that assessment was like a dirty word. Assessments like bad, like tests, especially for young children who are like, we're teaching in a developmental way and we want to let them grow in their own pace. I had a lot of those kinds of thoughts as an early teacher. And so I really shied away from like talking about assessment and thinking about assessment. And now I am completely changed. I had a friend and colleague who wrote a blog about like where the word assessment came from. It comes from the word assider, I think, which means to sit beside. And when I read that, I was like, that is how I feel. I am sitting, learning what they know, so that it can inform my instruction. And, certainly learning about assessment. And I did a lot of research for our book around like what assessment capable means. Like, what does it mean to be an assessment capable learner, a young child who's able to like reflect on where they've been and where they want to go and set goals for themselves. And I think it's actually really beautiful. And so my thoughts about assessment are very different now.
So in part of the work that I do with Boot Up, I created an assessment resources document to try and help new to computer science education educators, like, well, how do you assess? And so we tease out the differences between assessment and evaluation and say, well, they're two very different things, but there's different ways that you can assess. So like in America, the two most common ones are summative and formative. So in Canada, they have another one that they often refer to as ipsative. So summative is usually like an assessment of learning. What did you learn throughout this process? Formative is assessment for learning, but ipsative is assessment as learning. So when you're going through an ipsative process, the intent is to not only assess, but also to learn through that process to inform your like future goal setting and whatnot. So it's a really interesting thing to go through and to read that and go, why isn't that more common in America? Like, I barely hear anyone mention ipsative assessment.
I've never heard of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun. Like the document that I'll share in the show notes, like that has the resources to it. I'll link in it. It has some links to some like I forget the name of their Department of Education, but they have like several documents that specifically unpack, well, how do you use ipsative assessment in the classroom?
Wow, that is great. Thank you for sharing that.
So having worked with every grade, kindergarten and beyond, I know that the younger grade levels are very different than like even in upper elementary. I'm curious if you could share some of the challenges that like these early childhood educators experiences that other educators, even in the elementary space, might not be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the challenges are around making learning accessible. Well, I'll just tell a story. So one time I was in a new school environment, new faculty, new staff, and I was sitting at a table during like our first PD. And I teach TK, so Transitional Kindergarten, which in California is the first of a 2-year kindergarten program. So it's kind of unique to California. My kids are 4, they turn 5 in the first 3 months of the year. So I was developing a new program, standalone TK. And this teacher said to me, I think she taught high school and she said, oh man, I guess you're going to be doing a lot of cutting and gluing. And I just thought, and I had to say like, well, it's way more than that. So I think there's this one perception that like the academics are really easy, because the content, we all know 1 + 1, we all know 2 + 2, but I think there's a misconception, or maybe there's a thought of like, teaching foundational skills like that and making them accessible to a very diverse group of students is very challenging. So that's one piece I would say. And the other piece is just around social and emotional development. I think that, there's a perception that like, oh, it's all just like this touchy-feely time of friends and this and that, and like a lot of people may not realize like there's a lot of thoughtful skill that needs to go into supporting young children's social and emotional development in terms of all the skills that we might take for granted, and especially this year. I mean, a lot of times I've been describing this year and people are like, oh, wow, I never thought about that. For example, young children they've never been in a group. They don't know what it means really, many of them, unless they have a sibling, don't know what it means to take turns, to share materials, to ask for what they need, to ask me what they need. They're used to getting a lot from their parents or their caregivers. So what is a teacher? What is the role of a teacher, right? All of these things take a lot of care and thought. And I think, that's what I would say, that the early childhood teachers are very skillful at really developing and helping children develop these skills. And these, by the way, are not soft skills, right? They're not nothing. These are essential skills that I would argue are needed throughout, all learning, even adults. I think we see that, loud and clear right now. So that's probably what I would say.
Yeah, that's really making me think back to when I used to teach elementary general music and band. There were some music educators, and especially people outside of the field, who thought, oh, well, high school is harder to teach music than it is with elementary because all you're doing is teaching them hot cross buns and things like that. And it's like, no, having taught like professional level groups, like that is so much easier to refine things than it is to teach 30 kids simultaneously how to play 30 different instruments and they've never like held it before. Like to get them from making a sound that doesn't sound like a train to like playing hot cross buns requires a ton of skill and effort and whatnot. It is very difficult to teach those foundational skills.
Yeah. I had another teacher ask me if there were like standards, like, oh, are there kindergarten standards? Like, yes, of course. Like, but I mean, I understand, like, if you're not around, young children, you might not know. So I try, that's again, like a part of our book and my work is really just around, helping teachers know too, like about the many skills that teachers of young children have to have, academics as well as social and emotional learning.
What is social and emotional learning? And then how did you learn about it?
Yeah, social emotional learning, there's a lot of different places where you can learn, what it is. How I learned about social emotional learning, or SEL, you might call it, or the acronym. I was a founding teacher at a brand new charter school, and the charter school was founded on SEL was a core part of the mission and the vision of the school. So meaning that, we're not just going to focus on academic content standards. When I think about social emotional learning, I think about the many things that make us human beings, right? I'm not talking about your emotions. I think that's a misconception. It's not just your feelings, right? SEL is about your relationships, like how you develop relationships, how you set goals for yourself, right? Yes, it's about self-awareness, your self-regulation skills, right? But it's even more than that. It's your identity. It's how you problem solve. It's how you work with others and collaborate. And so much of SEL has to do with the political context we're in. Like, you can't separate who we are as people, our race, our gender, all of these things are a part of our identities. And I think SEL encompasses all of those things. So all learning is social and emotional, right? There's another misconception that like SEL is over here and academics are over here. And so, there's a great book that just came out a year or two ago. It's actually called All Learning is Social and Emotional, and really brings home that fact that if you have a child or an adult, frankly, who is in a learning environment, you can't tease out SEL, right? Because they're coming in with thoughts and ideas and feelings about who they are that is connected to how they learn content.
Right.
So,
yeah, a lot of those skills that you mentioned sound like things I have worked on through therapy over years, and it would have been nice to have developed those skills earlier.
Totally. Yeah. And I think unfortunately, I'd say it's fortunately, after the pandemic, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, now we have to focus on SEL. Right? Kids are coming back. They've all experienced trauma. And I'm glad that schools are beginning to acknowledge SEL in the midst of this pandemic. It's just surprising that it took a, global pandemic to make educators think about children's whole being and whole selves as they are showing up to a learning environment. There's a huge, focus now on SEL programs and curricula and, making sure we're addressing children's social and emotional development. But this is always important, not just after a trauma.
Yeah, and that also sounds like a misuse of SEL. Like, there are trauma-based approaches and therapies and whatnot, and those would probably be better suited for handling trauma as opposed to just crowbarring SEL into it.
Yeah, but hey, if that's something that comes out of this pandemic and, educators are focused on SEL in the classroom, that's great. I hope it doesn't go away.
If somebody's listening to this and they're like, I'm not really sold on it, like, why do you think it's important for educators to consider and learn more about SEL?
Yeah, I think it's important to consider SEL because, as I mentioned, SEL, social and emotional learning, all learning is social and emotional learning. And so teachers cannot possibly be teaching children without considering these skills. I just don't know how that would be possible.
So you mentioned a book. I'm curious, do you have other resources that you recommend for people learning more about SEL?
One resource that many teachers use is CASEL. So that is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So that website has a ton of resources. They actually have a new framework that's been really incredible called Transformative SEL. It's actually been linked to project-based learning in a lot of really positive ways, and there's some research around that. It's great to see the connection actually between SEL and PBL. So I would check out CASEL. That book is great. And so the book that I mentioned is called All Learning is Social and Emotional. That's by Fisher, Fry, and Smith. And I love their framework, actually. CASEL is great, but their framework, their model in their book, it has 33 different skills that are really deep to think about, and then different scenarios as a teacher that you would be, seeing those skills. One of my favorites that is new in there is public spirit, right? So this idea of really working as a leader, right? And being a leader in your community, things like that. So I definitely recommend that book. And I recommend checking out Transformative SEL specifically and some of the research that Castle has. The other resource I really, really love is Responsive Classroom. And Responsive Classroom has trainings and books that really transformed my work as a teacher in terms of language and culture. So building a positive culture in your classroom, which is deeply connected to developing children's social and emotional skills. And the other organization that I love, that I'm also a yoga teacher, and I work with an organization called Yoga Ed, which brings yoga tools into the classroom and for teachers, which also is really connected to SEL. And why I love Yoga Ed is that it embodies the ideas of social and emotional learning and brings it into your body and into your breath in the classroom. And so I do a lot of very simple yoga for transitions or movement breaks that is really connected to especially self-awareness and self-regulation in children. So I love Yoga Ed too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of yoga being used for self-regulation. I know of some schools that are using meditation in particular to help with that. So how has yoga kind of, other than like transitions and whatnot, how has it impacted your own teaching or even meditation?
Yeah, I mean, I've been practicing yoga for over 20 years. So for my own personal well-being, it's essential as a teacher, but also just as a human being. So I'm very connected to my body and my breath. But in terms of using it with my students in my classroom, and there's so many great resources that children love the challenge of yoga postures, and they love to do cool stuff with their bodies. And so that's just kind of fun. I mean, talk about the joy, trying to find this balancing pose, or, can you hold this pose for this long? And you do just really fun things. But also secretly, it's helping them pay attention to how their body's feeling and pay attention to their breath. Breath is such a powerful tool in terms of self-regulation. My class has what we call a peace corner. And that is a place where children, it's not a place I send kids. It's a place that a child says, I need to go there. They don't use the word self-regulate, but that's what it's for. We use the words like big feelings. You're having a big feeling and it's hard for you to stay in the class with us right now. You can go to the peace corner and put our timer on, and it's a couple minutes, and you could do some breaths. I teach them different breaths to do there. There's something to draw, there's books, there's blocks. And then when they're done, they come back, right? So it's teaching children how to self-regulate. It's the same thing adults need, right? And I tell them, I say, I need a break, right? Mindfulness, we do mindfulness in different ways. We don't call it meditation, I think, because maybe some people, maybe some negative thoughts associated with meditation, but mindfulness has become much more prevalent, I think, in educational. We use different curricula. I use the Mindful Schools curriculum. I use Mind Up. These are great resources to teach children really to pay attention to what's happening now without judgment. That's what I tell kids. Mindfulness is just paying attention to what's happening. I think that comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn, just the idea of we're paying attention to what's happening without judgment. And can we do that in different environments? We do Mindful Schools. I don't know if you've seen Mindful Schools, a great curriculum, but adaptable lessons on mindful listening and mindful breathing, mindful body, mindful tasting, so like this is a part of our school language, our classroom language. And then you can use it in, everyday context. Can you be mindful when you're lining up? Can you be mindful when you're sitting down at lunch and make sure that your body is in a safe space? Right. So like things like that, my kids are very comfortable with that. And that's school-wide. We do mindfulness practices.
The examples that you provided, both for yoga, like as a transition, and for mindfulness or meditation, however you want to frame it, is very different than I think most people think of. Like, oh, if I'm going to go to a yoga class, it's like an hour and I have to go and do this thing. One of the things that I've heard from, like, I listened to a podcast called 10% Happier with Dan Harris. And so he talks about how, like, you don't have to spend 2 hours a day meditating. Like, it could just be sitting for 20 seconds and just like gathering your thoughts, like you were describing with like, hey, just spend 2 minutes just kind of focusing on your breath and whatnot.
I love 10% Happier. And actually in the pandemic is when I found 10% Happier. So I forgot you'd asked about like, how is, this, my personal practice impacting my teaching. I had always done yoga, and certainly mindfulness is part of yoga. But in terms of practicing meditation, when we went to quarantine is when I found 10% Happier, his book, and then that podcast. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't have to be a big sit down thing, right? And it's accessible to anybody, including young children. And yoga ed is really incredible at bridging those things, right? So like bridging like what we know about mindfulness and yoga to children in a learning environment. And not only that, but for teachers, right? So they have all these great resources and tools for teachers because we need these resources.
Yeah.
I started to have a practice where actually this came from my brother-in-law who practices meditation. He says, every time you open a door, breathe in or breathe out, So like before I would walk into my classroom every day, I take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, like really simple things like that. And when it was remote, it would be opening my laptop, right? I'd like open my laptop, be like, okay, that kind of routine helps. And it helps children too. So when we come in from lunch and recess and we sit down on the rug ready for story, we do breath. When we, have a morning meeting and then we are about to shift into our first instructional block, we do breath, but they're like fun breaths, like you can do ocean breath or you can do bear breathing. And there's lots of different names for the breaths that yoga ed has titled so that it's easy to remember.
Yeah.
A bear hibernates in the winter and it's like breathe in, hold, breathe out for 3, right? Like imagine you're a bear, so the kids love that.
Yeah. And for anyone who's listening to this and who is skeptical, 10% Happier in particular, I think the subtitle is like meditation for the fidgety skeptic. So like one of the reasons why I love listening to that podcast is he interviews a bunch of people from many domains talking about how they use meditation or breathing techniques, like whether it's an Olympic level athlete or a high-level performing musician or a politician or whatever. There's all these different ways that you can focus on your breath, like using a square breath or a triangle breath or a rectangular breath, or there's one where you like inhale and then you do another larger inhale after that and then you exhale, and like that's used for anxiety management. Like there's so many interesting things that are backed by science. This isn't just like some woo-woo thing as Dan Harris would call it. Like it is very beneficial for anyone, whether it's adults or kids.
I try to model this for my kids too. So like teachers, we get frustrated, right? And instead of losing it or yelling, or, when I do go to those places, I am very transparent with my students. And I'm like, I need to take a breath right now because I'm feeling really frustrated. And they see me do it. Mm-hmm. Or I'm really aware that right now I'm about to, they call it flipping your lid in Dan Siegel's book, which I'm blocking out right now. I can find out. But he talks about like flipping your lid, right? Like your amygdala is getting hijacked. And so I'll teach my kids this idea of like your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. This comes from the Mind Up curriculum. And I'm about to flip my lid, and I'll just say to them, what's going to help me right now is just taking a couple breaths or like stepping outside for a second. And they see me doing that. And then I'll come back in and they'll be like, are you okay, Ms. Sarah? I'm like, yep, I'm good now. But then they'll do that. Right. So I think it's important to model that.
Yeah.
For children to know, just like, I'm having a big feeling, I need a break. What do? We don't have time out in our class. We don't have a place I send children. I might say, do you need a break right now? Or like, I think you need a break, which is different than the Peace Corner. And that's something that comes from Responsive Classroom. Just this idea of like, we're not giving timeouts, right? We are going to honor the fact that we all forget our agreements. Sometimes. And we might need a break to reset, just like I might need a break. So,
yeah. And to add on to the idea of modeling, I will be transparent in that I have scheduled after this interview, I'm going to meditate outside for 20 minutes. So that is something that I try and do midway through my day to just like do a mental reset, and especially going outside because I'm inside most of the time in front of a computer. I just want to get some vitamin D and whatnot. So
that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, one of the things the pandemic helped me to do is to find meditation and mindfulness. I also have a routine in the morning where I listen to a positive podcast, basically. So I wake up pretty early. I wake up at 5. And my routine is I wake up, I make coffee, I listen to some podcast like 10% Happier, Happiness Lab, something to help me kind of get in a frame, and then exercise or do yoga or work out, something like that, even before my children wake up and I have to start my day. It's really, really important for me to do that. But listening to podcasts that were around, that topic of meditation or mindfulness were really, really important. And I still do it, even though we've gone back.
So I'm curious if this will build off of what you're just describing. So working in education is difficult. There are many pressures and demands put on educators. But this last couple of years in particular has been very intense for educators. I'm wondering, how do you intentionally take care of yourself to try and prevent the burnout in general, and then in addition to all the stuff with COVID?
We're recording this in January. We just went back and it's been a really, really challenging time. I think it really has to do with balance and creating very clear boundaries, right? Like, I don't tend to bring work home with me very much. I'm a parent. So that's one piece of really trying to set some clear boundaries. Also, it's about really continuing to seek out new challenges and work that I love. When you talk about burnout, I've been in the classroom 17 years. It's really been important to me to focus on my overall purpose as an educator and my own commitment to growth. So that means doing things outside of my day of teaching, right, that are really meaningful to me, that stretch me. So writing the book was a great example of like, wow, that really was like another full-time job, but it was so important for my own development and growth. I work with PBLWorks as a national faculty member, doing work with them as a facilitator. So really focusing on my own growth is important to me. Also, just on a more personal level, like I'm very grounded in nature. I love hiking and camping and listening to live music, finding the things that bring me joy outside of the work. And also having like a few close friends work in education is so important, right? Especially this year. It's kind of been hard to explain to non-educators what it is like to be in the classroom right now over the last 2 years for sure. And so it's good to have people around who understand, just one or two. That's been important to me.
I'm curious if you can elaborate on the first thing that you mentioned. So how do you have clear boundaries if you're working from home, like in a remote setting?
Well, it was really about like having my own designated space for my classroom, which was like basically I have a small house. So I was in the hallway at a desk, closing my laptop and like getting outside. I would go outside for lunches. I would take my son on bike rides during the lunch, trying to do something different to sort of make that space different for myself. I saw a funny video that was like somebody like they're sitting on their couch, end of the workday, they close their laptop and they move over a foot and then they open their laptop and they're like, it's the weekend. But it's kind of like that. It's kind of like having a designated space, I think, to help. But also, like I was saying, my mornings of listening to a positive podcast, doing the dishes, exercising outside, like all of those things to mark beginning of work, pre-work, and then post-work. I also am lucky I live in Los Angeles. We live near the ocean. We can drive to the beach and see the beach. And that was really, really helpful. Being outside really helps me.
Yeah. Your joke about moving over a foot, like that, it actually sounds like one of the things that I did to separate my like work time from my leisure time on the same device. Like, so right now I have a monitor directly in front of me and then one angled to my right. But what I would do when I was switching to leisure is I would change that orientation. So now it's on the left of that angled monitor. And like that little thing, it made a huge difference. It was like, okay, no, I'm in leisure time. I'm not in work time right now, even though it's all the same hardware I'm using.
Yeah, that's great. The other thing I think I heard, I would always like get dressed and like put shoes on, right? Like I think something I heard that not everybody did, right? Like I would get dressed as if I was going to work. And then after work, it would be like, okay, my shoes are off and now I'm, in my sweats or whatever. So I think I didn't thought about that, but I think that was another thing that I did that helped me feel like I was working and not working.
When you're describing pushing yourself, like stretching yourself beyond what you can currently do, I'm curious, like, how do you use that to iterate on yourself and be intentional with practicing or improving your own abilities as an educator or in education?
Well, a lot of that has to do with really thinking about what I'm interested in and again, where my purpose is. So if my purpose is around empowering early childhood, for example, or to really build independent learners. So I have to ask myself, like, who's doing that work, and how can I learn from them? And, one of the answers to that question for me was the work of Zaretta Hammond, who wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And her book has had a really deep impact on me. So when just kind of being aware of what's out there, last year she had a beta of her PLC, Culturally Responsive Education by Design. And so I signed up for that. Like even though it was a crazy time for me, like I was teaching remotely and everything, but it was kind of like, well, when am I going to do this? And it was actually one of the most impactful. So it's things like that, really looking for people who I want to study with and learn with. The other thing is being able to be a member of the PBLWorks National Faculty. I mean, we haven't gotten a chance to have a summit. We used to have 2 summits a year together where all, 90 of us would get together and have a weekend of learning experiences and deepening our own practice around facilitation and consulting and coaching. Oh, I really miss those. It's just such an inspiring group to be a part of. And I'm always learning. So, even when I get a chance to be out like in the field, facilitating workshops and I get to work with another national faculty, we're at the same site or something. I mean, it's so, so inspiring. So, I think those are the most impactful times for me. And podcasts are helping too, like just introduce me to new people and new work and helping me think through how I want to grow.
What do you feel is holding back educators or the field, and what's something that we could do about that?
I mean, right now, I feel it's a very specific time in education. And what is holding back educators, I think, right now is like we are so stretched and drained. I mean, I'm speaking from experience, but just like there's just so much expected of educators. And now there's other just big things going on with race and equity. I mean, I just read an article that teachers would be mic'd and there would be videos in the classroom. I mean, these ideas that we can be monitored in this way, I mean, that would certainly hold me back. I mean, that's not happening for me where I am, but we need to be trusted. I think what is holding back educators, maybe the sense that like other people think they can do our jobs or other people think they know what it means to be a teacher and that we can just do it because we're either parents or we've been to school. So somehow just learning about all of the things going on around critical race theory and school boards, that is truly, I didn't think I'd go here today, but that really is on my mind. When you ask me about what's holding educators back, that would hold me back if I was in danger of being mic'd and videoed while I was teaching.
Yeah, when was it about May of 2020, when parents were realizing just how hard it is to teach a student. I thought we were reaching a tipping point where people were going to finally understand and the social status of educators was going to improve. But then how quickly did that flip with, oh, you're preventing me from going back to my job, et cetera, et cetera. Like we turned into babysitters again that they wanted to control. And it's a shame that it took that kind of a sharp turn.
Luckily, I'm in a great school where there's a lot of appreciation and a sense of gratitude, I think. But yeah, that would hold some teachers back. And I think a lot of teachers are burnt out and want to leave the profession because of those high expectations.
Yeah. What do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
Well, it's funny, like going back full circle from the first, story about my student, I wish there was more research on like the impact of project-based learning on young children. How is their questioning different? How could we, like their curiosity or their agency, like are those measurable and how and when, there's certainly been a lot of research around project-based learning in the last year or two. And there was one study that was about second graders, which was great to see. But I also wish there was more research on like younger children, like preschool, kindergarten, on how that impacts their agency and their skills in maybe 5th grade, but then even maybe later. That would be interesting.
Yeah, if there are more longitudinal studies, that would be wonderful. I did an interview with Andreas Stefik, and we discussed how some of the ways that higher education is structured for tenure and promotion and whatnot, it does not reward longitudinal studies. So what it does reward is putting out a lot of smaller studies. So that's what people tend to do so they can get more publications and presentations. And so less people will do the 5-year, 10-year projects because that won't get you tenure.
Got it.
Which is a shame.
Yeah.
What's something that you're working on that you could use some help with?
Yeah, I actually just enrolled in a course in instructional design. So that is new for me, but I'm super curious about it and really thinking about like how my skills as a teacher could translate into the instructional design process for different contexts, whether it's like probably an education company, but maybe other, going back to my interest in like mental health and well-being, is there a place for or a need for instructional design in some of those fields? So I'd love help with that. I'm always looking for help with, how to operationalize culturally responsive teaching and anti-bias work. So that is something I'm always looking for help with as well. Like I said, I did the PLC with Zaretta Hammond and really last year and trying to take what I learned last year and couldn't quite put into practice because I wasn't in person and trying to do more of that this year in my classroom with my students.
So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
Sure. So, first of all, my book is called Implementing Project-Based Learning in Early Childhood, Overcoming Misconceptions and Reaching Success. I co-wrote that with my colleagues and friends, Erin, Starkey, and Amanda Clark. We are all PBLWorks National Faculty, so you can find me at the PBLWorks website, which is a great resource for anybody who wants to try PBL. Lots of free, great resources there, as well as trainings and workshops. And then I have our own company, Early Childhood Project-Based Learning. We have a website, earlychildhoodpbl.com, where we have a blog and trainings and workshops, and we have an online course, and you can find me there. And then we also have a Facebook group that actually we just got up to 3,800 people. So really growing, wonderful community of educators, early childhood educators who are interested in PBL. And so that's really fun because I've been able to meet people from around the world who are doing PBL with young children. And again, great examples. People ask each other questions, share projects. So all of those places are places you can find me.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. Friendly reminder, you can find links in the show notes at jaredoleary.com or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. So that way you can check out the resources, organizations, and other episodes that were mentioned in this particular episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever app you're listening to this on. But stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you are all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.